Okay, Roger, thanks very much for agreeing to answer my questions about the EU.
My pleasure.
Before we get into the EU, can you just give me your sort of personal potted history in terms of what you did before politics?
Oh yes, I got a maths degree from Cambridge in 1965. I went to join Procter & Gamble.
Right.
I then worked for a series of mainly multinational companies in Britain, in Europe, occasionally in America, and I spent about 12 years in East and Southeast Asia. So I have quite a spread of international experience.
So what motivated you to give up the high life and get into politics?
Well, it was very simple, really. I was driving to a conference one day, and it was a conference organised to help business prepare to join the euro. And I think it must have been about December 97.
Right.
I heard on the radio a short piece, John Humphreys, saying that Conservative MEPs had come back from Brussels to Smith Square in London to ask William Hague to be more positive about the euro. Now, I've been a Conservative for many years, and I thought, what the hell's going on here?
Right.
Conservative MEPs pro-euro. And so it really started from there. I thought, who are we sending? And then I thought, well, maybe I better go myself.
You didn't try to become a member of parliament or anything? You decided to go straight to...
Yes, well,
Okay.
there are people who say, I want a second career in politics. I never said that.
Right.
There are people who say, shall I go to Westminster? Shall I go to Brussels? There are even people who say, which political party shall I join that will give me the best chance of a career in politics? No, I had no such thought. I just said, we got a problem in Brussels. I better go and see if I can do something about it.
So, Roger, explain to me, you were a Conservative for many years.
Yes.
And then you moved to UKIP. I know quite a number of politicians, and I know what a difficult decision that must be, because you've got a huge network of people that have supported you for many years,
Indeed, yeah.
that have gone out and knocked on doors, that have tramped the streets late at night on your behalf because you're their representative. So it must be a really tough decision to move. But so what made that happen?
Well, it's a tough decision, but I was reassured by the fact that the people who had elected me and had worked for me agreed with my opinions. After all, they selected me number one on the list 3 times running in 3 successive European elections. I had always believed that the Conservative Party was a Eurosceptic party, and when people said to me, oh, Cameron's not serious about Europe, I would say, well, wait till we have a Conservative Prime Minister. So we waited, and we had a Conservative Prime Minister. It became absolutely clear what my friends in UKIP had been telling me, that the Conservative Party wasn't going to take us out of the EU. The other issue, I'd started to take a considerable interest in the questions of climate change, energy policy, and I just felt the direction we were going was absolutely wrong. And if you look at the decimation of energy-intensive industries across Britain and indeed across Europe since that time, Port Talbot just in the process of closing, we've had an energy policy which has been a disaster for Europe. It's creating an industrial massacre. So I had 2 big issues. My first big issue was Europe itself, and related, part of the European issue, was the issue of energy policy, which is so critical for our economy, where I felt that the Conservatives were just plain wrong.
The sort of central purpose of this video piece at the moment is to really understand how the EU works. It seems sensible just to start with the basic history of the EU, doesn't it? It was initially conceived in the 40s and 50s, really, wasn't it?
Yes, well, they were dreaming of it, I think, in the 20s and 30s, but the actual practical action started after the war with an honourable objective, and the honourable objective was to make sure that we never had another destructive European war like the 2 we had in the early part of the 20th century, and the formation of the coal and steel community, because coal and steel were the sinews of war, if you like.
Right.
And if those were jointly owned and jointly controlled, it would be impossible for one country to make war on another. And of course it's still impossible. I mean, if we in Britain, it's an absurd idea, but if we in Britain wanted to create a heavy bomber to bomb a country on continental Europe, well, we can't, because the only large aircraft really made in Europe these days are Airbuses. We make some of the important bits, we make the engines, we make the wings and so on, but we couldn't make the whole aeroplane.
Okay, so you need steel and coal, or oil. At the time it was coal, so therefore steel and coal were, how did it work? It became sort of jointly owned?
Jointly owned and operated, yes,
Okay.
so that it became impossible for one country to dominate it. But the objective was always there, and this is something that's important to understand, and I think most people who follow it will be familiar with it. But the dreamers of the time, like Jean Monnet, they had a clear objective of creating something like a United States of Europe.
Right.
And some of the quotes, well authenticated quotes from Jean Monnet, for example, said, "It would be impossible to sell that to the people today. What we must present it as is merely an economic opportunity. It's about trade, it's about jobs, and that way the people will come along with us."
Okay. So it wasn't a sort of yearning for a democratic Europe. It was a yearning for what? For
Who knows what was going on in their minds? I'm sure they would have said they wanted a democratic Europe. They still talk about democratic values. And yet, if you look at the response of the European institutions, for example, to referenda, they have a mountainous contempt for the view of the public. If the public vote the wrong way, the answer is go away, vote again until you get the right answer. The Danes, the Irish, and even with the Constitution, what was that, about 10 years ago, the French and the Dutch, thank God, voted against it.
Yeah.
It didn't go away. They just took the same document, changed the name, and said, right, it's a treaty now, it's not a constitution, so we don't need a referendum.
Okay. I remember this happened twice in France, twice in Ireland.
Twice in Ireland, yes, both times. And both times, of course, there was enormous pressure, enormous bribes offered, massive publicity to try and change views.
And if the UK votes leave on the 23rd of June, is that what's going to happen?
Well, in many ways, if we vote leave, that is not the end, that is the beginning.
Okay.
It's the beginning in two senses. It's the beginning of a process of renegotiation. And of course, we have Cameron saying, you can't tell us exactly what will be the outcome. Well, of course we can't.
No.
But we do know that free trade is better than political union. So we're going the right way. But that will be quite a process, and there is a danger there, I think, that they could try and drag out the 2 years, because they can be extended, the 2 years of the Lisbon Treaty renegotiation process. Imagine they dragged it out beyond the next British general election, and a new incoming government said, right, well, we've got a new mandate from the general election, and we said we would reconsider the position with regard to Europe. That is a danger that we need to watch out for. The other sense in which it is a beginning, not an end, when we leave, there will be a period of turbulence, of course there will, but after that we will be seen to be doing so much better and free to do useful things that member states in the European Union can't do. I am sure that a number of member states, especially in Northern Europe, will be saying, well, if Britain can do it, we can do it. Yeah. They may go exactly the same route, or at least they may seek a very different relationship within the European Union. I think that our leaving could transform the whole thing. And my ideal objective is I want to see a Europe of democratic nations trading and voluntarily cooperating as independent nations with each other. That is the kind of democratic Europe that I would like to see. I think that we can stimulate that, we can start that process by leaving, and to quote an ancient statesman, we can save ourselves by our exertions and we can save Europe by our example.
Right, okay. Let's just get into how Europe actually works, because you've worked in the European Parliament for how many years now?
17.
17 years, okay. Now, let's just compare and contrast. So it's pretty straightforward in our national parliament, isn't it? We have a national parliament. We elect politicians once or every few years to become the government. Yep. And in theory, they come up with a manifesto of all the things they're going to do, and we vote for them. Whoever their leader is, we know is going to be the Prime Minister, yep. And whatever their positioning is, their manifesto says the things they're going to do, and we elect them, whoever we prefer, and they then get on with it.
Yep.
Europe's very much more complex than that, isn't it?
It's entirely different. Just to qualify, by the way, in the UK, I think what's important is that the voters roughly understand how it works, and you gave a good description of it. It has got more complicated because when we had a two-party system, you could bet that one or the other would win mostly, so you knew where you were. Now we've got a 3.5-party system, and so it is much more complicated, and we've got the Scottish nationalists muddying the water in Scotland, of course. But in Europe, it is quite different. The people we elect, the MEPs, do not form a government. The Commission, which is appointed, not elected, is in control of the whole process, and in particular is responsible for drafting new legislative proposals. The Parliament will debate those and can vote amendments to them even when it's voted the amendments, those go back to the Commission and the Council, which is the representatives of the member states. And basically they sit in a room and the first one that blinks is lost. It's that sort of deal. So it's a very complicated process, very difficult to understand. Much of the law, the legislative proposals, are drafted by effectively secret committees of specialists who have considerable influence on the process. And then again, you've got 10,000 or so lobbyists who are knocking on the doors of the Commission and the Council and the Parliament, seeking to influence the process. So it's a very complicated, very obscure process, and frankly, it lacks any kind of realistic democratic accountability.
Okay, so I have in the past lobbied members of Parliament and achieved some results. Now, if I wanted to achieve something that related to a European law or a directive, I'd approach you then, would I, Roger?
Well, the advice I give to people is that you should first approach the Commission, because the Commission is going to be drafting the legislation. If you can influence the Commission at that stage,
right,
that is the most effective thing to do. After that, if it gets as far as the Parliament, then by all means lobby the Parliament and see if you can influence the votes in committee and the votes in plenary. But let me qualify that, because people say, well, come on, Helmer, you're elected to the European Parliament amongst 750 other MEPs elected to the European Parliament. How can you deny that that is democratic? And I'll give you an example. What tends to happen is, how do you get elected to the European Parliament? At some point, you put up your hand, probably in a political meeting, and say, I'd like to be considered as a candidate.
Yeah.
Why do you do that? For the great majority of people in the great majority of parties, it's because they're passionately keen on the European project.
Right.
So, overwhelmingly, the members of the European Parliament, obviously with exceptions like UKIP, we're there for a different reason, but the great majority are passionately in favour of the project.
Right.
And the best example I can give you is, again, going back to the European Constitution 10 years ago. That was voted on in the Parliament. I haven't got the exact figures, but something like 90% of the French MEPs and something like 90% of the Dutch MEPs voted in favour. When it got to the referendum in their respective countries, I think it was 57% of the French people voted against and 62 or 3% of the Dutch voted against. A complete mismatch between the reaction of the elected MEPs in Brussels and the views of the people out there in the country. And that, I think, illustrates the lack of democratic accountability in the European Parliament. It comes up again and again. I mean, I used to be on what I call the Unemployment Committee. They call it the Employment and Social Affairs Committee for many years. And again, we would vote for particular measures which would damage employment opportunities, which would cost jobs. And sometimes I would go to some of the other MEPs afterwards and say, why did you vote for that? You'll lose jobs in your country. Your voters will lose their jobs. And they would say, oh, come on, Roger, we know you think like that, but actually we're building Europe. We've put another brick in the European construction. This is what we're here to do.
Right, okay. So they're on a mission, really, towards a federal Europe.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, so, Roger, just getting back to the European Commission then, because this is to me, seems to be the guts of this. The European Commission draft legislation. Do they initiate the legislation? Where does it come from in the first place?
Yes, they initiate it. Now,
Okay.
Of course, they don't do that in a vacuum. They may be approached by member states who are concerned about particular issues or want changes in the law. So there are inputs from different directions, maybe inputs from the Parliament as well. But actually, they are the only people who, under the treaties, have the right to sit down and draft the first draft of the legislation. And of course, that has an enormous impact.
But the democratically elected people don't.
We as MEPs cannot create legislation. No, what we do, the draft from the Commission comes first of all to the relevant committee, and we often have turf wars about which committee it should be, and sometimes it's two committees. But it goes through committee, and the committees have a chance to amend it.
Yeah.
Those amendments then go forward to the plenary session of the whole Parliament, where further amendments can be made, and the amended version then goes back to the Commission. They look at what the Parliament has asked for, and they talk to the Council about it, and they either accept those amendments or not. It then normally goes through a process of a second reading, where it goes back to the committee, back to the plenary session. Further attempts can be made to amend it. Then you finally get to the sort of head-to-head, where the Parliament version is up against the Commission and the Council, and they have a thing called a trialogue. And as I indicated earlier, it's a case of smoke-filled rooms till late at night, and whoever blinks first is lost.
Okay. So basically the issue here is that the people who initiate the laws are not democratically elected. So you can modify them.
Modify them, but in theory the Parliament can actually knock them back. It very, very rarely does.
Okay. But you can't initiate them at all.
No.
So your electorate can't appeal to you to change the law, to make the law.
No, they can appeal to us to vote in a particular way on. I mean, take an example. Firearms legislation. A lot of lobbying at the moment. People very upset about new rules on firearms that affect antique firearms and museums and so on. Okay. And so we can possibly have some influence on that.
Okay.
But so often on substantive issues, I mean, it's almost become a joke now that I come up with the same line. People come and talk to me and say, we're very concerned in this industry or that industry about some proposed piece of legislation. And I say, well, look, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is I agree with you. I will vote exactly as you want me to vote. The bad news is, in my estimation, we'll lose the vote. And that happens again and again and again. I mean, voters take a mixed view of industry, and they often look at certain industries, like the banks and the power companies, and they may be very unhappy with them. But at the end of the day, it's industry that creates wealth, it's industry that creates jobs, that pays taxes, which pay for our schools and our hospitals. Mm-hmm. It's industry that pays wages and pays pensions. And so, broadly speaking, we should be supporting industry because we want prosperity, we want jobs, we want to generate wealth.
So as well as these three bodies, we've got the Parliament, we've got the Council of Ministers and the Commission.
Yes.
We've also got the European Court of Justice.
Yes.
And the European Central Bank. How do they fit into the mix? Because they're pretty key as well, aren't they?
Well, yes. The European Central Bank, of course, is very much involved in financial decisions related to the euro currency and particularly quantitative easing and all those things they're trying to do to make the euro fit the whole of Europe, and of course it doesn't.
Yeah.
In the case of the Court of Justice, they are there to appeal to if anybody or any organisation feels that there's been a breach of the law that works against them. But the European Court of Justice is notorious in terms of it almost invariably makes decisions that support European integration.
We've got EU law and we've got EU directive. What's the difference?
One of them becomes law automatically whether you like it or not. The other has to be passed into law in the member states individually. But normally they are nodded through. There's very little that member states can do to resist pieces of legislation they don't like. And by the way, the British government has been outvoted on pieces of legislation more often than I believe any other member state.
Let's just kind of focus on democracy and European democracy. One of your previous Conservative colleagues, Dan Hannan, has a very simple way of putting it. He says, look, there is no European demos. And demos, as I explained in one of the previous videos that I've done, demos means the people.
Yep.
Kratos, which is the other component word of democracy, means power. So it's power in the hands of the people. But the real question is whether or not we have a European demos, isn't it? Because what makes up a demos, do you feel?
You need a group of people who share enough in common in terms of history, culture, language and economic interests that they are prepared, I love this phrase, prepared to accept governance at each other's hands. That is the issue, that the people consent to be governed together. Mm-hmm. Now, I consent to be governed together with the British people. I don't consent to be governed by Latvians and Croatians and Portuguese. I have great respect for them. I want them to be happy and prosperous, but I don't want them making my laws.
But in terms of accountability, how does that affect us?
What it means is that we have institutions that are making decisions, in a sense, almost in a vacuum, without any democratic accountability. And the fundamental point, and this came up in the 1975 referendum as well, the question is, can you fire the people who make your laws? If our laws are made in Westminster and we don't like what they do at the next general election, we can get rid of them. Yeah. We may find that we don't like the next lot any better, but at least we can get rid of the ones we didn't like.
And also it's fair to say, isn't it, that the fear of losing the next election will constrain politicians from getting carried away.
Oh, absolutely. There isn't really that constraint. in the European institutions. The processes of appointing the President of the Commission, the President of the Council and so on, are remote from democratic accountability, so they have a completely different set of objectives.
Okay. So, if we want to have a European demos, we'd need to share a language.
I believe that shared language will be critically important, yes.
Now, I remember as a child people talking about Esperanto, which sounded like a lovely idea that we'd all speak the same language, although it sounded a bit Spanish. It seemed like the Spanish were getting the language, and it seemed a bit unfair on that basis. But I just wonder if possibly the answer is that we should sort of all get together as European countries and sort of make up a language we'll take some English words and some French words and some.
Well, I think the Esperanto experience actually tells you it's a lovely idea in theory. In practice, nobody's going to be bothered. The other point, of course, is the English language, which is becoming a global language. I think if you want a European language, let's make it English. Already, some of the smaller language countries, the Finns and the Portuguese, will actually speak in English in the Parliament. And of course, the parliamentary interpretation services get quite cross. But they will say, look, if I speak in English, 60% of the people understand me without translation. If I speak in Portuguese, only 5% of the people understand me without translation. So I think in practical terms, if you want a common language, but there's more to it than that. It's language, it's culture, it's history, it's economic interest. Now, our economic interests diverge. You can see with the Euro project that an exchange rate that's good for Germany has been a disaster for Southern Europe. So maybe in 200 years' time, there will be a European demos. I doubt it myself, but maybe there will. And in a way, I think it might be disappointing because we value our culture.
Yeah.
We don't want it homogenized across Europe. No. We want to work with people. We want to be good neighbours. We want to trade. We don't want common governance. It doesn't work.
It seems to me that if you want to have a European demos, it's not just that we would really need to have a largely shared language. We get on okay in the UK. A few people speak Welsh. A few people speak, other dialects, if you like. We have communities who speak their native language if they're first-generation immigrants or whatever, or second-generation immigrants. Even sometimes will speak within their families as different language. But, being multilingual is not a problem. The problem is not having a common language. Really,
not having a common language and common media too.
Yeah.
I mean, we watch the BBC. I read the Telegraph. They read different papers on the continent, and although some of the international news will cover the same stories, it may cover it from a different angle, and much of the news will be completely irrelevant. Much of what I read in the Telegraph would have been no interest to somebody in Rome or Helsinki.
I'm very conscious of that. If we look at the Scottish referendum, I find it impossible to believe that the SNP would have got as far as they did do were there not a Scottish media.
Indeed.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Well, yes, it's a case of identity. I'm a great believer in the proposition that political institutions have to match the identity and aspirations of the people. That's why a county council makes sense, in my view, and Westminster makes sense, in my view, and Brussels doesn't make sense, in my view. Now, of course, the big question that people always ask is, well, what about Scotland? And in the end, only the Scottish people can decide. I hope very much that they decide that being part of the United Kingdom, and we do share a common language of a different accent, is of value. I value Scotland, and I hope Scotland will value England. But in the end, I have to admit that it's a decision for the Scots, and if they want to go, they'll have to go.
I understand, Roger, there are literally thousands of lobbyists in Brussels. Is that right? How many?
Absolutely true. I've heard a figure of 10,000. It's difficult to be sure.
Okay, and what are they? What are all these thousands of people doing all day, and on behalf of who?
Well, usually there are two groups that they're working on behalf of. There are lobbyists working for companies, and there are lobbyists working for NGOs.
Right.
Many of the NGOs, by the way, are supported through the Commission by taxpayers' money, and it's kind of like a hall of mirrors, because you get the lobbying companies and the lobbying NGOs almost reflecting back what the Commission wanted to do anyway. In the case of the industrial lobbyists, it's a bit different. They're looking at pieces of legislation, they're flagging up concerns about the impact which that legislation might have on those industries. Now, there are lots of people who think that lobbying is a terribly bad thing and is kind of vaguely wicked. Usually those people are opposed to industrial lobbying, but absolutely in support of Friends of the Earth lobbying, which is an entirely different matter. My view is, frankly, I have learned an enormous amount about a whole range of industries by listening to what the industries have to say.
Yeah.
We are representing people. People have jobs. People work in industries. So therefore, in a sense, we're representing industries. We're legislating for industries. I think it would be outrageous if we were legislating for industries, but saying we won't listen to the concerns that industries have about this legislation. Of course we should talk to industry about their concerns. We should use our judgment. We shouldn't just do what they tell us, but we should listen. And we do, and I'm happy to do so.
You say you listen, but you're not enacting the law. You're not enacting the laws. All you get to do is modify them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But they will come in and say, look, there's this amendment that really, really matters to us. Will you vote for it?
Okay.
And we'll look at the amendment, and if we think it's a reasonable, fair amendment, then we'll vote for it.
But in terms of initiating law, they're talking to the Commission, presumably.
They will talk to the Commission.
Okay.
Yes. So you've got these people actually following the volume of legislation. I mean, there are people out there who think I should follow all the legislation and advise them in hundreds of companies up and down the region, whenever there's something that crops up that affects them. But frankly, I could spend 24 hours a day doing it and still not cover it.
Okay. I'm slightly frustrated by the fact that I think you're far less outraged than I am about the way that the Commission works.
Oh, well, I'm outraged about it in the sense that it's anti-democratic, it's undemocratic, it is designed to be insulated from public opinion, and therefore we ought to leave. So I don't jump up and down with anger, I just get on working towards let's get out.
Yes, okay, fine. Makes sense. There's this anomaly, isn't there, that there are two locations for the European Parliament. What's going on? What's all that about?
Actually, three.
Three.
There's an awful lot of what the Americans call pork barreling. In other words, the money being spent, each member state wants a bit.
Right.
And bear in mind that we started out with 6 member states. They all wanted a bit. So France got a bit in Strasbourg, and Belgium got a bit in Brussels. And actually there are 3 locations, because Luxembourg got a bit too. Members don't meet in Luxembourg, but there's still a big establishment, lots of people, lots of archives, lots of interpretation done. But yes, we have what we call the travelling circus. Typically we do 3 weeks in Brussels, then we go down to Strasbourg. Now Strasbourg's a lovely town. I am very happy to spend a few days in Strasbourg. I just don't understand why the European taxpayer should pay for me to do so. And the other point is Strasbourg is almost impossible to get at. So yes, it's completely indefensible, but it still goes on.
Right, okay. And it was because no sensible compromise could be reached, was it? Is that why?
It was. I mean, it goes back to the Lib Dems were fond of blaming John Major and saying he signed up to it. Well, he did, but it was horse trading.
Right.
He wanted his opt-out from the Working Time Directive, his opt-out from the euro, and the price he had to pay for it was accepting the travelling circus. It's European horse trading. You know, the deal on European horse trading is I agree to do something bad for my country in exchange for you agreeing to do something bad for your country, and that's exactly what happened.
Okay, right, okay. Let's just get back to the original countries of the EU. What does Germany get from the EU, and what does France get? Should we start with Germany? What does Germany get from the EU, Roger?
Well, what Germany gets from the EU is it's almost, if you like, it gets forgiveness for the terrible things that happened in the 1940s.
Yeah.
They wanted to show that they were now good Europeans. They're peaceful. They want to be team players. That's what they get. What they also get, and they're almost embarrassed by, is they've got a dominant position in Europe. They like it or not, and I'm not sure they do like it, they are the leaders in Europe. What did the French get? The French got, as they felt, some degree of control over Germany. Also, they get a lot of money.
Right.
It's a simplistic thing to say, but there is some truth in it, to say that the Germans got the industry and the French got the agriculture. There's that element of dividing it up. So those are the benefits they got.
David Cameron sort of encapsulated his argument for Remain in 3 factors. He said we were going to be stronger, more secure, better off. Is that right?
Those are the sorts of things he's saying.
Okay.
I don't know what he means by stronger, but frankly, as a province in a larger unit, we have no voice at all. As an independent nation, we are the 5th largest economy in the world. We're a member of the G7, the G20, the UN Security Council. We have a very strong voice as an independent nation. Security, I mean, his argument on security has been blown out of the water by recent events. Clearly, we can't be absolutely safe, but we can be safer if we are exchanging information with serious players like the Five Eyes, including the Americans, the Canadians, and so on, in fact, most of the Anglosphere, if we are controlling our borders, if we are able to deport terrorists, these are the important factors. We will continue after we leave the European Union to exchange security information with Europe. They need it. They get more out of us than we get out of them. So the security argument for me is absolutely clear. We are more secure within our own borders, controlling our own country, than if we were out. Now, economically, of course, the argument rages back and forth. But if I recall, the benefits of the single market were estimated by none other than Peter Mandelson at being 1.8% of GDP. The costs of excessive regulation were estimated by Mr. Verheugen, who was commissioner some years ago, at about 5.5% of GDP. Wow. So from that point of view, it's clear to me that we are better off out. People like Patrick Minford and Tim Congdon have done independent estimates of the total costs of membership, not just the net costs, but the total costs, including regulation, including the common external tariff and all those other costs, misallocation of resources. They both come out between 10 and 11% of GDP. That is a massive dead weight on our economy. We get that cleared out of the way, we shall do so much better. We can have sensible energy pricing. We can hopefully bring back some of the industries that we've lost. We can have our own trade deals with major countries like India.
Do we need trade deals?
Well, under WTO rules, we can trade actually pretty well without them. I mean, take China. China sells more into the EU than Britain does. We're all signed up to the World Trade Organization, although sadly Britain is represented by Brussels in the World Trade Organization. When we leave, we will resume our full seat on the WTO and all the associated organizations. But it's a set of global trade rules. When we joined the common market, typical industrial tariffs were 30 or 40%. You know, they were a major, major barrier.
Right, let me just understand, make sure I understand that. Typical industrial tariffs were 30 or 40%. So you're saying that 30 or 40% would have been added to the value of goods we're exporting?
Added to the cost. So if you're a customer in France,
you'd have to pay 30 or 40% more.
Yeah. But today, under WTO rules, the average figure is down to 2 or 3% across the great majority of products. So in other words, because global tariffs have come down, it is now much easier to export. And as I say, the major countries that export stuff into the EU, Russia, China, America, do so without the benefit of any special trade terms. They're just trading under WTO rules. So the costs of being outside the common external tariff have greatly reduced. But the other critical point is we buy massively more from the continent than they buy from us. When we leave, we will be their biggest customer in the world, bar none. Bigger than America, bigger than China, bigger than anyone. We are their biggest customer. They simply cannot afford to have trade with us disrupted. Therefore, we shall find it very easy to negotiate a free trade deal with them after we leave. Digby Jones, former chairman of the CBI, said we'll do it in 24 hours. Now, I think that was a throwaway remark. I think it might take a little longer than 24 hours, but we'll do it very comfortably in the 2-year period of the Lisbon Treaty.
And even if we were not to, we're not talking about this 30-40%, we're talking about a few percent.
We're talking about a few percent. Put it another way, if we were outside the common external tariff and all the goods we exported to Europe, we were actually paying duty on, the total amount of duty in a year would be about £4 billion. Currently, our net contributions to the European budget are about £12 billion. So even on that comparison, we'd be better off.
So we could build 100 new hospitals a year and
Indeed.
And do that, and still pay the agricultural subsidies to our farmers.
A vital point you've made there, yes. There are people like farmers who are saying, what about our CAP checks? There is the whole of the universities, academia saying, oh, we depend so much on European research money. In fact, we'll have much more money when we leave because we only get back roughly half what we put in, plus the administrative costs of operating it. I reckon that each pound we get from Europe costs the British economy about £3. We will be much better placed to support our farmers, to support academic research, to do all those things we want to do when we've left than we are now.
Okay, so let's just get to the question of what the EU costs us. You've touched on a couple of figures. I'm interested to know what the EU costs us, the money we send to the EU. I want to understand how much we get back in terms of money that the EU choose to spend on our behalf
Yep.
on the basis of their priorities, not ours.
Right.
And then thirdly, what chunk of money goes to the poorer countries? And in fact, fourthly, what bit goes in administration? Can you remember all those?
Nearly. I don't have exact figures, but roughly, we're putting in about 20 billion a year. We're getting something like half of it back.
Right.
As you rightly say, we're then being told what to spend it on, which may not be on our own priorities.
Okay.
But what we're also finding is that with more and more poor Eastern European countries joining, Croatia, Romania, Bulgaria, and the threat of Turkey joining, which is an enormous issue coming down the track, more and more of the money that we used to think of as coming to Britain, the structural funds, the CAP funds, more and more of those are being diverted and will continue to be diverted to Eastern Europe. So, if we want to subsidise Bulgarian farmers and Romanian farmers, and indeed French farmers,
Yeah.
fine, stay in, keep paying the money, and the French farmers will be laughing all the way to the bank. But if you actually think that British taxpayers' money should be spent in Britain, then we are much better off out.
Okay, so if we take the net figure of 12 billion, okay, it's not, because some of there's money on top that the EU is deciding to spend on our behalf, but let's just, for argument's sake, take 12 billion. What's getting lost in sort of administration in the EU?
Well,
is it a large proportion? Or?
A considerable amount goes to the actual cost of running the institutions.
Yeah.
But there's another aspect that is frequently forgotten. Most of the money that comes to academic projects, to industrial grants, to all those things, you have to apply for. Many more people apply than actually get the money.
Right.
So it's not just the man hours that go into preparing a long and complicated proposal in order to get a grant. It's also all the other companies or universities that made applications and didn't get the money. You've got all those hidden costs of all this whole administration application process.
One of the charges levelled at the EU by economists in general is that it's protectionist. What does that mean?
Well, it has a protectionist mindset. The Common Agricultural Policy is particularly protectionist. I'll never forget meeting the development minister of Indonesia on a trip I was making out that part of the world, and he said, "Look, we appreciate the foreign aid we get, but actually we don't need foreign aid. If only you would open your market so that we could trade with you, then." We wouldn't need the aid. We would trade our way out of poverty. Not that they're poor anymore, but that's the issue. I get very cross about all this fair trade stuff with sort of little itsy bitsy policies supposed to help third world farmers. The best way we could help third world farmers would actually be to stop the EU being protectionist.
How is it being protectionist though? How are they prevented from trading with us?
Either rules that don't allow products in, or tariffs that prevent them from importing products.
And the tariffs are much higher than the sort of 2 or 3%, aren't they?
Yeah.
So the EU is imposing very large tariffs.
The EU has all sorts of complicated rules that prevent actually quite a number of Commonwealth countries from exporting the sort of basic produce that they would like to export.
Right.
You see it actually coming up in other areas as well, where they're constantly trying to put various protectionist measures into trade agreements. Sometimes they're looking at imposing their values on third world countries. And yes, of course, we all want proper treatment of workers, but if you make the rules so stringent that no developing country can meet them, effectively you're barring that country from...
Okay. So, for example, if farmers in Africa are producing a crop, but they don't have the labour laws in place that the EU requires them to have,
the EU will find a way of excluding those products. Yes.
Okay. So it's not really about tariffs as such.
Well, it's about that, but it's about many other issues as well. There is a strong tendency in the European Union for them to see trade agreements not merely in terms of trade, but to see them in terms of imposing what they would call European values, which is an excuse for protectionism, because you set standards which in European terms look like sensible standards, but actually applied in Zimbabwe, they don't make any sense at all, but they prevent that product being imported.
Okay. And let's get on to something you brought up earlier, energy policy.
Yes.
Something you clearly know quite a lot about. Educate me, Roger. I have no idea.
Well, it is fantastically complicated. The EU has set up a whole range of arguably conflicting objectives. Objectives for renewable energy, objectives for emissions, and you can see how those would conflict, for example, because a nuclear power station will help you solve the emissions question, but they don't regard it as renewable, so it sort of falls between two stools. They have the European emissions trading system, which is supposed to send price signals to reduce CO2 emissions. In fact, it's failed and failed and failed again. Instead of saying it doesn't work, they come back with a new fix each time. Yes, we know the problems, we've got to fix. And then 5 years later, you look at the fix and say that didn't work either. It isn't just the European Union. I mean, George Osborne has looked at this failed emissions trading scheme where he would say the cost of CO2 emissions is too low. He's introduced in Britain a carbon price floor. Now, this helps to explain why Europe has the most expensive energy prices pretty much in the world, and Britain has the most expensive energy prices pretty much in Europe, and that's why we're losing things like our steelworks at Port Talbot.
Okay, the energy prices that go into industry producing things is adding such an overhead that we're making ourselves uncompetitive on a worldwide basis.
Absolutely, yes. I love to quote Antonio Tajani, who was, until recently, the Industry Commissioner and Vice President of the European Commission. He's now an Italian MEP. He said, with energy prices, we are creating an industrial massacre in Europe. Now, that's very colourful language for a European commissioner. And we're seeing closures in energy-intensive industries. We're thinking a lot at the moment about steel, but there's aluminium, there's chemicals, there's fertilisers, there's petroleum refining, there's ceramics, there's glass. All these industries are energy-intensive, and it is much cheaper to move your factory to the Ukraine, to Turkey, to North Africa. Lots of companies literally are doing that. So that instead of having in Europe these factories, they're moving out just outside Europe, where it's cheaper to do all these things.
Explain to me the dichotomy, the difficulty that the EU presents in relation to the Welsh steel issue that's just come up in the last couple of days.
Well, it's very clear, and it's a three-pronged issue. The first prong is energy prices. Energy prices are far too high. The second prong, the second issue, is Chinese exports. They are dumping steel. They've got overcapacity. They're dumping steel on world markets. The Americans have imposed anti-dumping duties, in some cases up to 250% on Chinese steel. The EU has dithered and dithered and dithered and finally come up with 9% or 13%. So in other words, a trivial response too late. And the final issue is state aid. Now, we know that you can't support an uncompetitive industry forever, but there are cases, and this could be one of them, where state aid on a temporary basis could give a breathing space to an industry to restructure. We can't do that because of Brussels rules. So there are three clear areas where the government might want to take action, it simply can't. Okay. And we see government ministers saying, we'll do all we can. And the question is, what can you do? You're in Europe. Okay. You can't do the things you need to do.
And does this take us right back to the start? Because presumably if you don't have any steel production, we've got North Sea oil, I know it's running out.
Yep.
We're planning to frack all over the place and produce
shale gas.
And if we lose our steel industry, then we can't go to war either.
Well, there's a yes and a no here. There are two sides to the argument. The world is awash with cheap steel from many sources. So it isn't a case of the Chinese can turn off the tap. We can get it elsewhere. We can get it from America. We can get it from Europe. And okay, we want to stop dumping of Chinese steel. In other words, we want to apply anti-dumping tariffs. On the other hand, if you're a car manufacturer making cars out of steel, you may be quite glad to be importing cheap steel because it helps you to be competitive with your cars elsewhere. So there has to be a balance. You can't just go over the top with these things. But clearly, there is a problem with the steel industry. A lot of people feel, and I think they're probably right, that steel is fundamental to industry. And for a major economy like Britain to have no steel industry at all is a bit frightening, quite apart from the tragic issues of what's going to happen to Port Talbot. And here, clearly, is a case where membership of the European Union has prevented us from protecting our steel industry in the way that we should.
Am I being alarmist by saying, look, historically we've been in a situation before where we've had a European superstate which became a dictatorship, but which grabbed power via the ballot box initially, as a separate island nation, does it make sense not to at least have the ability to produce our own energy and steel for the very reason that the European Union came about in the first place?
Well, I personally think, and maybe this is a big risk, I personally think that we've got past the stage of major wars between major powers in Europe. I just don't think it's going to happen. I think our economies are so integrated and will continue to be so integrated even when we leave the European Union, that the idea that France could make war on Germany is just silly. It's not going to happen.
Okay.
So I'm not worried about that. On the other hand, we are surrounded by other threats, new nuclear powers emerging, terrorist threats, all these things. And yes, we need to be able to look to our defences. I think we could always obtain steel from abroad, but look at our balance of payments. You know, how many industries are we going to let go and have to buy in glass, fertilizers, chemicals, all these things? We're having to buy in because we're no longer making them here in the UK. That's a critical industrial issue.
Okay.